to acknowledge the work as well that was done during Storm Owen by the frontline staff. And Kieran, a lot of work that you've overseen in Laois when you're Director of Services, the culverts and different things, different pieces of infrastructure that was put in, stood up fairly well to the test. But here's what I'm going to have to highlight. There are some problems. The first thing is in relation to the generators for rural group water schemes. That won't be Ishcairn won't do anything about that, because Ishcairn has no role with rural group water schemes, and it's an issue that local authorities need to deal with. The local authorities need to, particularly big schemes. Kieran, you'll be familiar with the one for the Heath, for example, and the Ballyroan, Ballypica schemes. You know, they're all big schemes, supplying thousands of households between them. And the same in every other county. I do think that, just to note that, and I'm saying that that's an issue that needs to be dealt with separately, because that's the division, the way it works. And just to move on, that the number of local authority staff has ballooned. And I'm going to say this to the department in particular, Keith. This is an issue you need to take on board. You're granting the staff for arts, for community, for this, for that, the other, right? And there's some fault as well with the local authorities, because the list that you're putting in, the requests that you're making for resources, you know, it's ballooned out. But what it doesn't have is GOs, general operatives. And this is a real problem. There was less than 50 GOs in Laois during the last Storm Owen, right? And this is a problem, because you don't have the people to go out, first of all, to do the maintenance, preventative maintenance. A pallet stuck in a culvert, blocking it, that's not caught time before the storm happens. Now, that's not taken away from the good work that's been done by the skeleton staff that's there. But you have huge municipal areas with an overseer with a handful of workers. That's no good. And local authorities have to get back to what they should be doing. And I'm saying to the County Managers Association, and it's not, I'll be saying it locally as well, and I'm saying it to yourself, Keith, that you need to stop this. You need to get local authorities back to what they're doing. You're approving staff, requests for staff that the place is full with them. There's armies of staff in the local authorities, but they're not where they need to be, right? And I'll stop on this. On the housing section of Laois County Council have started using more indoor, more of their own staff, direct labour. Guess what? They're doing relets for houses a lot quicker. Guess what? They're doing them a lot cheaper. And I'm giving that example, and you need to get back to that. And I'm making that point. The second point I want to make is that the ESB, you're in the same situation, because you don't have the linesmen now. That I welcome the fact the legislation is coming through, and I know you're trying to progress, and I welcome that. And just to say, your response was phenomenal. You know, you had to go in and work in very difficult terrain, getting into wooded areas. You know, it took days to cut your way in. Very, very difficult for the staff, and you know they really need to get full credit for that. But some of the outages were caused by branches overhanging. You know, but in not that many decades ago, a couple of decades ago, linesmen. I don't think you still have linesmen, you call them technicians now, linesmen, crews would be out there, every linesman crew, there was general operative, there was ganger, and maybe 2 linesmen, and they had a crew cab, and on the back of that they had chainsaws, they had everything, all the equipment that they needed, and they took care of all that. So a lot of those small outages, you know, where a bough of a tree or something like that came down. So is there any? No, I think recently you've started increasing your staff, and I welcome that. And by the way, I welcome the expansion to the training centre. I wasn't able to make it that day, but the best luck with it in Port Laois, fantastic. But do you intend expanding the number of outdoor staff to actually deal with that kind of preventative maintenance? That's the question I'm asking.
Taking the order. So CCMA first. That general operatives, is there? In your view, is there an issue in terms of supply, and is it a factor in terms of storm response?
I wouldn't call it a general factor in a current response. Look, we're under a budgetary constraints. We have a workforce planning system.
Get approval, Kieran, for other staff.
But we're going to, let me answer the question, we're going through a workforce planning process. Every year we do the budget, and that's a sign, and there's difficult decisions to be made. We would love more staff. There is, I think, in the next 2 years, with the full transition of Irish Water or Ishcairn, and the staff will move, or that we will end up in most authorities with a lot of staff being retained, which will add to our staff numbers. All I know from our own example in Meath, that we have increased the GO workforce over the last couple of years quite substantially. I'm sure other authorities are in the same process, but it is a local resource issue based on the size and scale of their own authorities. In relation to Ishcairn and the group water schemes, it was an issue that I was very acutely aware of during the whole process. I have to admit at the start, yes, Ishgaren's focus was in relation to the public water supplies, but I have to give them a compliment that once they had the bulk of their own public supplies sorted, they recognised that the group water schemes didn't have the capacity and capability to sort themselves out. In some very substantial schemes across the country, as you say, they did step in, and now they have acknowledged that role of support for group water schemes, and I think that we would have to acknowledge that. Connie, is there anything you want to add around GOs?
Yeah, I suppose I would say, like, in a severe weather event, so we were lucky enough, Sormawen passed us by, but we did have the severe snow before that in Carlow. Like, you'd never hold the staff complement the GOs that would deal with a severe weather event. So there's always going to be a need to bring in...
Sorry, I understand that. And I'm not saying that you can have all this big army here ready to go and you hold them on 52 weeks of the year. I'm not saying that. But because you don't have enough GOs to actually carry out the small preventative maintenance, you wind up with a larger problem when there is a storm. And I've given some examples. I've seen them.
Well, I can only speak for the counties I've worked in. Yeah. Like, I wouldn't say that necessarily. There's always more jobs than we can do. That's the nature of what we do. We have TDs, councillors ringing us constantly, and we get to what we can when we can. That's a reality, you know. At the moment, I would feel we have enough GOs. We're always, and as Kieran says, we're going to transfer them back from Irish Water, and that will increase the complement. Okay. But you also have to be careful that you're not carrying people that you don't necessarily need all the time.
Okay, great. ESB.
I'm going to pass it to Brian to comment on the resourcing.
Yeah, Deputy.
Are you going to increase the number of general operatives and linesmen?
Yes, so even this year, Deputy, we've increased our number of apprenticeships intake into our training centre in Portlaoise from 60 last year to 156 this year, so over a doubling, and that is part of a continued programme to build our own internal resource capacity. But in addition, in the timber space, as you mentioned specifically, we've done significant work in growing our timber cutting capacity this year. So this year we've increased our timber cutting capacity by about just under 30% and continuing to grow that further. And we're doing that with great help from the ETBs, particularly Galway Roscommon ETB, where we've developed with them an apprenticeship programme for timber cutting, two-year programme that provides Indigenous employment locally.
For your staff?
No, these would be through our contractors. Okay. So we do all of our planned timber cuttings with our contractors, but our technicians do have some capability to do light timber cutting branches and like what you mentioned earlier.
Okay, great.
Department, no, just the department didn't answer.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll bring you back in on that. All right, you're 2 minutes.